The first time I saw Karen march up to my gate waving a crumpled piece of paper and shouting the words, "Court warrant," I thought it was a prank. I mean, who claims to have a warrant for a neighbor's front yard? She was red-faced, panting like she'd just sprinted across the cul-de-sac, and clutching the document like it was the Declaration of Independence. Behind her, two of her fellow HOA zealots hovered nervously, as if they weren't sure whether to cheer her on or drag her back to her SUV before she embarrassed them further. But Karen was committed. She slammed the paper against the metal of my automated gate, barking that I had 48 hours to comply or face immediate removal. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh, but my sarcasm reflex was stronger than my sense of humor. So instead, I leaned casually against the post and said, "Funny, warrants usually come with a badge, not a coupon stapled to the top." Her jaw locked, her nostrils flared, and she launched into a tirade about how the HOA had unanimously voted to inspect my property for safety hazards and aesthetic violations. The so-called hazards? My gate, my garden shed, and the fact that I had the audacity to refuse her invitations to HOA board meetings. She didn't like that my house was independent from their neighborhood's power structure. She didn't like that I had a gate at all. And most of all, she didn't like that I told her no every time she tried to tell me how to live. That morning, she decided to upgrade her fantasy from nagging neighbor to federal agent. And unfortunately for her, she picked the wrong day to test my patience. Because what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my gate had just been rewired. It was an innocent upgrade on my end. I'd had trouble with people trying to force the gate open before, so I had a licensed electrician install a higher voltage deterrent system that activated when tampered with. It wasn't lethal, but it packed a jolt strong enough to discourage even the most stubborn intruder. Karen, of course, thought the rules of physics didn't apply to her. So while she yelled about warrants and power, her hand inched toward the latch. I didn't stop her. I didn't have to. The moment her fingers wrapped around the cold steel and she yanked, the system delivered its lesson with a bright crackle and a sound that was half scream, half banshee wail. The HOA flunkies gasped. Karen staggered back, her hair slightly frizzed and her warrant fluttering to the ground like confetti. I should have felt guilty, but instead I felt an almost serene calm wash over me. Because in that instant everything shifted. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about Karen finally learning that she couldn't bully people into submission with fake authority. This was the opening shot in a battle she thought she'd started, but one I was more than ready to finish. The day after Karen's electrified humiliation, I expected her to retreat into her house for a cooling-off period. Most people, after all, don't come back from being zapped in front of their neighbors without at least a little self-reflection. But Karen wasn't most people. Her ego wasn't built for retreat, it was built for counterattack. And sure enough, by mid-morning, I saw her minivan roll into my driveway as if nothing had happened. This time she wasn't alone. She brought backup. 2 uniformed security guards stepped out behind her, one tall and lean, the other short and square, both wearing matching reflective sunglasses that made them look like mall cops auditioning for a bad action film. They had batons clipped to their belts, radios crackling static, and the smug body language of men who'd been fed a very selective version of the truth. Karen strutted up to the gate again, pointing at me like a general addressing her troops. "There he is," she barked, voice shrill. "That's the man who assaulted me with an illegal electric death trap. Arrest him, and disable this gate immediately." The taller guard cleared his throat and shouted, "Sir, open the gate. We're here to conduct an investigation." I leaned against the fence post again, coffee mug in hand, savoring the déjà vu. "Funny," I said. "I didn't realize the HOA had its own private police force. Did you guys take an oath of office at the annual bake sale?" Karen's lips tightened. The shorter guard puffed out his chest and held up what looked like an ID badge. Except it wasn't. It was laminated, yes, but instead of a state seal or official insignia, it displayed the HOA's logo, a crudely drawn sun over a picket fence. I nearly spit my coffee. Nice, I said, nodding at the badge. Where do you keep the handcuffs? Next to the lemonade stand. The guards exchanged uneasy glances. They weren't used to being mocked, clearly, but Karen doubled down, shrieking about her rights as president of the HOA, and threatening lawsuits so fast it sounded like she was auctioning off grievances. Her goal was obvious: overwhelm me with noise and fake authority until I folded. But what she hadn't calculated was that I'd already spoken to the actual sheriff's department the night before. After the gate incident, I figured she'd escalate, so I got ahead of her. The deputy on the phone had laughed outright when I described her warrant, and told me in no uncertain terms that if anyone tried to impersonate law enforcement, I should film everything and let them handle it. That advice was about to pay dividend. So while Karen rattled off accusations, I pulled out my phone, tilted it slightly so the camera caught her, the guards, and the gate in the frame, and hit record. "Karen," I said calmly, "you are trespassing on private property with 2 men impersonating officers. Unless you'd like the sheriff here in about 15 minutes, I suggest you leave before things get even more embarrassing." That line hit harder than the 220-volt. The guards shifted uneasily, and the tall one muttered, "Wait, you're not actually under their HOA?" "Nope," I said, smiling. "Independent property. Not under their jurisdiction. Which means right now you're trespassing at her command. How does that sit on your liability insurance?" The guards froze, like I'd just read them their obituaries. Karen screeched at them to ignore me, to cut the gate's power and drag me out, but the spell was broken. The taller one whispered something to his partner, then both turned on their heels and marched back to the van without another word. Karen chased after them, screaming betrayal, but they drove off before she could yank the door open. For the second time in 2 days, Karen was left alone at my gate, shaking with fury and clutching nothing but her pride. She kicked the metal once, shrieked something about "this isn't over," and stormed back to her house. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The rest of the day was eerily quiet, which in Karenland meant she was plotting. And I was right. That evening, I caught her peeking out from behind her blinds, phone pressed to her ear. By midnight, my suspicions were confirmed when my neighbor Dave texted me, "Heads up, Karen's telling people she's filing a criminal complaint against you tomorrow. Claims you're operating an illegal electrified barricade." I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my phone. Karen had finally hit the nuclear button, accusing me of running a booby-trapped property like some villain from a spy movie. Except this wasn't just ridiculous anymore, it was dangerous. A false criminal complaint meant paperwork, hearings, maybe even an officer knocking on my door with questions I didn't deserve. So I spent the next morning doing what Karen never thought I would. I prepared. I pulled every receipt from the electrician who installed the gate. I had the permits from the city that approved the upgrade. I even had a copy of the security footage from the moment Karen zapped herself, which clearly showed her ignoring the warning signs posted in bold letters. "Do not touch gate. Authorized access only." My evidence folder looked like something out of a courtroom drama, and I couldn't wait to drop it on the sheriff's desk. Sure enough, at around noon, a cruiser rolled up. Not flashing lights, not sirens, just a quiet approach. A deputy stepped out, young but steady, hat tipped low. He greeted me politely, asked if I'd heard about the complaint, and then, with a half-smile, said, "I already have a pretty good idea what happened. But why don't you tell me your side?" I didn't rant. I didn't whine. I simply laid out the facts like a lawyer savoring closing argument. Permits, receipts, footage, each piece landed like a hammer. When I showed him the video of Karen theatrically pressing her warrant against my gate before grabbing the latch, the deputy actually chuckled. "Well," he said finally, flipping his notebook closed, "that clears that up. Your system is legal, properly installed, and clearly marked." She touched it against warnings. "I'll be filing this under self-inflicted consequences." "Appreciate it," I said, smiling. "Does this mean she's done?" The deputy smirked. With people like her? Never. But I'll be making a note in the report that any further false complaints from her will be considered harassment of law enforcement. That usually quiets things down. I thanked him, shook his hand, and watched him drive away. And for a fleeting moment I thought maybe, just maybe, this whole saga was over. But that night, as I closed my blinds, I saw something that made me pause. Karen wasn't hiding this time. She was standing in her driveway, arms crossed, glaring at my house. And next to her was a man I'd never seen before. He wasn't dressed like a guard or a neighbor. He wore a suit, dark, tailored, serious. He carried a briefcase, and when Karen leaned in to whisper something, he nodded slowly, eyes fixed on my gate like a general sizing up a battlefield. I didn't know who he was, not yet. But I knew this much. Karen had just escalated to her next move. And if history was any guide, it was going to be even louder, crazier, and more dangerous than the last. The man with the briefcase showed up at my gate the very next morning. I half expected him to knock politely, but he didn't. He simply stood there in his dark suit, polished shoes sinking into the gravel, and stared through the bars like I was some kind of zoo exhibit. Karen hovered behind him, arms folded tight, lips pinched into a permanent scowl. Her eyes flicked from him to me with the gleeful expectation of a child waiting for fireworks. "Good morning," the man said finally, his voice smooth, practiced, too professional for a cul-de-sac. "I'm Mr. Doyle. I represent the Homeowners Association." He held up a leather folder embossed with gold initials, the kind lawyers buy when they want to look intimidating. "We have some serious matters to discuss regarding your hazardous gate and noncompliance with community standards." Karen chimed in instantly, as if she'd rehearsed the line with him. "He's operating an illegal fortress. It's unsafe, unsightly, and against the bylaws. We're filing for immediate injunction." I sipped my coffee slowly, savoring the taste of cinnamon creamer, and leaned against the post. "That's adorable. Just one tiny problem. I'm not in your HOA." Mr. Doyle adjusted his tie, clearly unbothered. "While that may be technically true, your property abuts HOA-managed land. Your structures, including this electrified gate, present a clear and present danger to members of the association. That gives us standing." Karen smirked like she'd just won a chess game. I almost felt bad ruining the moment. "Standing?" I echoed. "You mean like how you had standing when you shoved your hand onto my gate and lit yourself up like a Christmas tree? Because I've got video of that, complete with the warning signs you ignored." Doyle's expression flickered, just for a second. He wasn't used to his script being interrupted. He tried to recover, flipping open his folder and pulling out a thick document filled with paragraphs, clauses, and bolded threat. He held it through the bars for me to see. "This is a formal notice of intent. If you don't disable your gate within 7 days, the HOA will pursue civil action." Karen's smile widened as though she could already taste victory. But Doyle made a mistake. He let me take the paper. I skimmed it, and within 30 seconds I realized it wasn't a legal document at all. It was a Frankenstein's monster of copied text from various statutes, stapled together like a high school essay. Entire sections contradicted themselves. One page even referenced a boating dock ordinance. We were nowhere near water. I looked up at Doyle and deadpanned. "Tell me, did Karen type this herself, or was it your paralegal? Because my 5th grader could do better with Google." Karen screeched. Doyle stiffened. His polished mask cracked just enough to reveal annoyance. "You may mock this, sir, but litigation is expensive. Are you prepared to spend tens of thousands of dollars defending yourself?" That was his play. Not facts. Not laws. Just intimidation through the threat of financial exhaustion. A classic Karen tactic, dressed up in a suit. I didn't flinch. "Actually," I said, pulling out my phone, "I spoke to the county clerk yesterday. Already filed for a declaratory judgment. Got the receipts from my electrician, the permits from the city, and a copy of Karen's greatest hits video reel. Gate grab, fake warrant, mall cops running away. If you'd like, I can forward the folder to your email so you don't embarrass yourself in court." For the first time, Doyle looked uncertain. He glanced back at Karen, whose face was now turning a blotchy shade of red. She hissed at him like a stage director urging an actor not to blow their line. But Doyle clearly wasn't paid enough for this circus. He closed his folder with a snap and muttered, "We'll be in touch." Then he walked briskly back toward his car, leaving Karen frozen in place. She spun on me, shrieking about betrayal, cowardice, and "How dare you speak to my lawyer like that?" I just waved, lifted my coffee in a mock toast, and retreated inside. But I knew she wasn't done. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. If Doyle was gone, she'd simply find another pawn. Sure enough, the next escalation came less than 48 hours later, when I woke up to find orange spray paint scrawled across my driveway. Words like criminal, danger, and hazard stretched across the concrete in sloppy block letters. My mailbox had been stuffed with HOA pamphlets about community safety. And taped to my gate was another notice, this one demanding immediate access for inspection. I didn't need a detective to know who'd done it. Karen's handwriting was as sloppy as her planning. But instead of blowing up, I documented everything. Photos, timestamps, even samples of the spray paint. Then I called the sheriff again. This time, 2 deputies showed up, and they didn't waste time. They marched straight to Karen's house, pounded on the door, and within minutes she was out on her porch arguing with them. I stood at a distance, arms folded, watching the theater unfold. She waved her arms, pointed at my property, ranted about bylaws and warrant. The deputies shook their heads, scribbled notes, and finally one of them said something that made her freeze. Even from across the street I could hear it. "Ma'am, this is vandalism. If we find your fingerprints on that spray can, you'll be facing charges." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She stammered excuses, blamed local kids, even gestured wildly toward another neighbor's teenager mowing the lawn. But the deputies weren't buying it. They warned her once more and left with the evidence bagged. I thought that might be the nail in her coffin, but Karen was nothing if not persistent. That evening, she came back, alone this time. No lawyer, no guards, just raw fury. She pressed herself against the bars of my gate, glaring through as if her rage could melt steel. "You think you've won," she spat, voice low and shaking. "But I will bury you. I'll shut off your power. I'll cut your lines. I'll make this house worthless. You don't understand who you're dealing with." Her threats weren't empty anymore. They were desperate, venomous, the kind of words that reveal just how far someone is willing to go when cornered. And as much as I enjoyed watching her unravel, a part of me realized the game was shifting into dangerous territory. That night, I double-checked my security cameras, reinforced the locks, and reviewed the footage of her tantrum. I had enough evidence to bury her in complaints of my own. But I held back. Because deep down, I knew Karen was about to overreach in a way that would finish her. I didn't have to wait long. The very next morning, as I was pouring my first cup of coffee, my lights flickered and died. My phone buzzed with a notification. External power supply disconnected. Outside, I heard the faint whine of an engine, and when I stepped to the window, my jaw tightened. Karen was standing at the side of my property with bolt cutters in her hand, grinning like a child who'd just pulled the plug on a video game console. Behind her, the utility box hung open, wires dangling, sparks spitting faintly. She looked up, saw me watching, and actually waved. That was the moment I realized she'd just made her fatal mistake. Because tampering with power lines isn't just vandalism. It's a felony. And this time, I wasn't going to let her wiggle out with excuses. The hum of silence after my power went out was almost surreal. The fridge clicked off, the AC unit stuttered, and even the fish tank bubbler died with a faint gurgle. It was as though Karen had just declared war on electricity itself. But I didn't panic. I walked to my kitchen counter, poured the rest of my coffee while it was still warm, and waited. Because unlike Karen, I understood how consequences work. I didn't have to wait long. The sound of sirens cut through the neighborhood air within 10 minutes. First a sheriff's cruiser, then another, then a utility truck pulling in behind them. My driveway looked like the staging area for a small operation. I stepped out onto my porch, arms folded, as the deputies marched straight past me toward the side of the property where Karen had been playing electrician. They found her still there, bolt cutters in hand, crouched like a raccoon caught in the garbage. Sparks still flickered faintly from the box she'd mangled open. The look on her face when she turned and saw the deputies was pure disbelief, like she'd been expecting applause instead of handcuff. "Ma'am, drop the tool," one deputy barked. Karen froze, then sputtered, "I was doing a safety inspection. He's running illegal wiring. I'm protecting the community." The deputies didn't even blink. "Ma'am, you're tampering with live electrical equipment. That's a felony. Put the cutters down now." For a second, I thought she might actually swing them like a weapon, but the taller deputy unholstered his taser just enough to make her reconsider. She dropped the cutters, arms flailing as she launched into one of her famous tirades, this one heavy on property rights and HOA authority. The deputies didn't buy a word of it. They spun her around, cuffed her, and began marching her toward the cruiser. Neighbors were already gathering. Curtains twitched, doors cracked open, phones tilted discreetly to capture footage. Karen, always obsessed with status, was now the star of her least flattering show. She thrashed, screamed about lawsuits, even tried to invoke her imaginary warrant again, but the deputies guided her into the back seat like they'd done this 100 times before. One of them turned to me. "Sir, you'll need to give a statement. But from what we can see here, this was pretty cut and dry. She cut live power lines. That's not something we can ignore." I nodded. "Take your time. Coffee's still warm if you want some." The utility workers set about restoring the power, shaking their heads at the amateur carnage Karen had caused. One of them muttered, "She's lucky she didn't fry herself." Another laughed, "Guess 220 volts weren't enough last time." By the time my lights flickered back on, Karen was gone, hauled downtown for processing. The deputies took my statement, collected the video from my cameras, and assured me that charges would almost certainly stick. For the first time in weeks, I felt like maybe, just maybe, this nightmare was about to end. But I underestimated Karen's desperation. The very next day, she was back. Released on bail, still raging, still certain she was the righteous defender of suburban order. She showed up at the end of my driveway surrounded by a cluster of her loyal HOA board members, all of them red-faced and sweaty, waving protest signs that looked like they'd been made in a rush with poster board and permanent marker. "Hazard House," one read. "Down with death gates," said another. "Unsafe neighbor," screamed a third. It was so absurd I nearly laughed myself hoarse. There they stood, chanting like they were at a political rally, except the only audience was a few bewildered neighbors recording from porches. Karen was at the center, shouting slogans and waving a megaphone like a dictator whose army was made of retirees with knee braces. I didn't engage. I sat on my porch swing with a glass of iced tea and watched. The protest lasted 2 hours before fizzling out under the weight of boredom, heat, and indifference. By the end, even Karen's most loyal allies were slinking back to their minivans, muttering excuses. Karen stayed, though, pacing and glaring like a wolf circling prey. That night, I heard her again. Not chanting this time, hammering. I checked the cameras, and sure enough, she was at it again, this time trying to install a chain across the public sidewalk in front of my house, as if she could blockade the world out of spite. She pounded posts into the dirt with a mallet, sweat dripping, hair wild. I didn't bother calling the deputies this time. I walked out with my phone recording and simply asked, "Karen, is this your idea of infrastructure development? Should I call the city planning department, or are you filing for federal highway funds?" She screeched that I had no right to film her, tried to rip the phone from my hand through the gate, and nearly fell over. The footage was gold. By the next morning, it was all over the neighborhood's private Facebook group. Someone, probably Dave, had uploaded the clips of her arrest, the protest, and her midnight construction project. The comments section exploded. Neighbors who'd once been too scared to cross her were now openly mocking her. Memes popped up overnight. Karen photoshopped onto construction crews, Karen holding lightning bolts, Karen with devil horns captioned, "Power hungry." It was the first time I'd seen the tide turn publicly. And Karen knew it. She stopped walking the neighborhood with her clipboard. She stopped knocking on doors. She started glaring from her blinds like a dethroned monarch watching peasants dance in her courtyard. But dethroned monarchs are dangerous. And Karen wasn't about to fade away quietly. 2 nights later, I was woken at 3 a.m. by a crash. The unmistakable sound of metal against metal. I bolted to the window and saw headlights jammed against my gate. Karen's SUV, nose crumpled, bumper hanging, wheels spinning uselessly against the steel. She had rammed it, actually tried to batter her way through like a one-woman siege engine. I ran outside as she stumbled from the driver's seat, barefoot, hair disheveled, muttering nonsense about taking back control. Her hands were bleeding from where the airbag had slammed them, but she still clawed at the gate as though sheer willpower would undo physics. "Karen," I said, voice steady, "you've lost your mind." She whipped around, eyes wild, spitting. "This is my neighborhood. You don't belong here. I'll tear this down even if it kills me." Her words weren't metaphorical anymore. She meant them. And that was when I realized, this wasn't just entitled arrogance anymore. This was obsession. Dangerous, unhinged obsession. I backed away, phone to my ear, calling the deputies again. They arrived fast. By now, my address must have been flagged in their system. They pulled her off the gate, cuffed her again, and this time there was no protest from the crowd of neighbors gathering in pajamas. They didn't shout, they didn't argue, they applauded. Actual applause rippled down the street as Karen was shoved into the back of the cruiser, her SUV still bleeding coolant onto the pavement. One deputy shook his head. "We're done giving her slaps on the wrist. This time, the DA's office is going to have a field day." When Karen rammed her SUV into my gate, part of me believed that had to be the crescendo of her madness. What could possibly top trying to literally drive through reinforced steel in the middle of the night? But Karen, true to form, still had one final act left in her crumbling empire of entitlement. The morning after her second arrest, my neighborhood woke to silence. No HOA flyers shoved into mailboxes. No shrill barking orders in the cul-de-sac. No SUV parked crooked in her driveway like a queen's carriage. Just silence. For a brief, blissful moment, I thought she might finally be cooling her heels in jail long enough for us all to breathe. But around noon, a convoy arrived. Not sheriffs this time, moving trucks. 2 of them, big enough to empty a mansion. They rumbled into Karen's driveway and workers began hauling furniture out the front door. Boxes, lamps, even that ridiculous oversized birdbath she'd bragged about importing from Italy. Neighbors gathered like it was a parade. Dave strolled over to me, phone in hand, grinning. "Word is," he whispered, "her husband finally had enough. Filed for separation. House is going up for sale." I blinked. Seriously? Oh yeah. Apparently the bail money tapped their savings. Add the legal fees, fines, HOA lawsuits, and the SUV she totaled against your gate. Guy decided he's not going down with the ship. I should have felt triumphant, but what I really felt was inevitability. Karen had been building her own guillotine one outrageous act at a time. Now the blade had finally dropped. She showed up an hour later, fresh from county lockup, hair frizzed, clothes wrinkled. When she saw the moving trucks, she screamed loud enough to rattle windows. She tore down the driveway, shrieking at the workers, grabbing at boxes, trying to yank her life back into the house. But the workers ignored her. They had papers, legal orders, authority she couldn't bully with bylaws or fake warrant. She spotted me watching from my porch and stomped toward my gate. For once, there was no performance, no clipboard, no entourage. Just raw, broken fury. "This is your fault," she screamed. "You poisoned this neighborhood. You turned everyone against me." I leaned casually on the railing. "Karen, you did that all on your own. All I did was keep the lights on while you cut your own wires." Her face twisted, somewhere between rage and despair. She grabbed the gate again, and I swear for a second she almost forgot about the electricity. But even Karen wasn't foolish enough to shock herself twice in one lifetime. She pulled back at the last second, shaking, muttering curses, and finally retreating to watch helplessly as strangers dismantled her kingdom. By evening, the trucks were gone, her SUV was towed, and her once pristine lawn was littered with scraps of cardboard and a toppled garden gnome. The queen had been dethroned. But the aftermath was where the real victory lived. Over the next few weeks, the sheriff's office finalized charges: felony tampering with utilities, vandalism, trespassing, and resisting arrest. The DA took one look at her history of complaints and called it a pattern of harassment. The HOA board, embarrassed by her antics and fearful of liability, voted unanimously to remove her from her president's seat. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was free of her iron grip. The gossip spread like wildfire. At the grocery store, people whispered about her downfall in checkout lines. At church, folks prayed not so subtly for neighbors who have lost their way. Even the barista at the local coffee shop asked me if it was true that she'd tried to ram my gate with her SUV. I confirmed it with a straight face, and she gave me my latte on the house. As for Karen herself, she vanished. Rumor had it she'd fled to her sister's house 2 towns over, pending trial. Others claimed she was living out of a motel, clinging to whatever scraps of control she had left. Wherever she wasn't here. And that was all that mattered. The day the for sale sign went up in her yard, the neighborhood erupted into an impromptu block party. People brought out grills, coolers, lawn chairs. Music played. Kids rode bikes up and down the street without Karen shouting at them about sidewalk ordinances. Someone even hung a banner that read, "HOA equals happy once again." I stood with Dave by the cooler, sipping a beer, watching people laugh like they hadn't in years. "Feels weird, doesn't it?" he said. "Like when the power comes back on after a blackout," I replied. He grinned. Except this time, the blackout's name was Karen. We clinked bottles and toasted to freedom. Weeks later, the gate, my infamous, allegedly lethal barricade, was still standing tall, gleaming in the afternoon sun. Every time I walked past it, I couldn't help but smirk. It wasn't just a gate anymore. It was a symbol. A reminder that no matter how loud, entitled, or absurd someone might be, the truth has a way of shocking them back into reality, sometimes literally. And yet, the part that stuck with me most wasn't the arrests, the lawsuits, or the moving trucks. It was the way Karen's downfall reminded everyone else in the neighborhood of something they'd forgotten, that her power had only ever been an illusion. She controlled people through fear, through volume, through the appearance of authority. But once someone stood up and said no, the whole facade crumbled. A few months later, new neighbors moved into her house. A quiet couple with 2 kids and a golden retriever. They planted flowers, waved when they saw me, never once tried to tell me what color my shed should be. The transformation was almost poetic. Where Karen had built fences, they built connections. Where she'd wielded rules like weapons, they brought over plates of cookies. It was like the neighborhood had finally been reset. Sometimes, on summer evenings, I'd sit on my porch and watch the retriever chase the kids across the lawn that used to be Karen's kingdom. I'd sip my coffee, the gate humming faintly behind me, and think about how close we'd come to letting one person's madness rule us all. Karen wanted to be remembered as the queen of the HOA, the enforcer of order, the one who bent everyone to her will. Instead, she became a cautionary tale, a meme, a punchline, a reminder that power without respect is just noise. The last I heard, she took a plea deal. Probation, fines, community service. Rumor had it her assignment was picking up trash along highways in a fluorescent vest. Maybe, just maybe, cleaning up other people's messes would teach her something about cleaning up her own. As for me, I didn't gloat. I didn't spike the football. I simply carried on, calm and unbothered, the way I always had. Because in the end, the best revenge against people like Karen isn't to destroy them, it's to live well while they self-destruct. And so that's exactly what I did. The gate still stands. Strong, silent, ready. And every time I walk past it, I smile at the memory of Karen's final words before they hauled her away that last time. You don't understand who you're dealing with. Oh, I understood perfectly. It just turned out she didn't.